In December 1941, in the heart of the Pacific, a world was set on fire. Pearl Harbor, the U.S. naval base in Hawaii, was reduced to a hell of smoke and fire on a calm, sunny morning. Japanese bombers and fighters emerged like black bats from the fog and changed history in a matter of hours. Thick smoke rose from burning ships, the sea mingled with oil and blood, and the bodies of sailors floated in the flames. The attack, which claimed the lives of more than 2,000 Americans, raised the pride of one empire and crushed the pride of another. In the White House, President Franklin Roosevelt's face was set in cold silence as America's military commanders grappled with a grim reality. Japan had attacked before declaring war. But behind this ruthless onslaught was a hidden figure, the mastermind of the plan, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a calculating, Harvard-educated man, a former officer in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He knew that America could only be defeated by shock and speed before its industrial might could awaken. His plan had worked, at least initially. But deep within America, the seeds of revenge were sprouting. A few months later, the flames of war had spread across the Pacific. Ships and planes were moving from both sides of the ocean. The Americans, wounded by Pearl Harbor, entered the fray with renewed determination. At Midway, the tide turned. The U.S. Air Force, with incredible precision, destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. At that moment, Japan knew that its enemy was invincible. Yet Yamamoto remained the mastermind of the military. He believed that the only way to maintain Japan's superiority was to keep the morale of the troops up and keep fighting. In early 1943, after Japan's crushing defeat at Guadalcanal, Yamamoto decided to inspect the frontline troops. He wanted to show that he was still in control. But the trip would prove to be his fate. In those days, one of the greatest intelligence achievements of World War II was quietly made. The Americans had cracked the secret codes of the Japanese military. The decryption was the work of a team of America's best mathematical and linguistic minds who worked day and night in small, smoke-filled rooms, reading and rewriting the codes. Among the messages, one shone like a flame in the darkness: Yamamoto's detailed travel itinerary. The decoded message said that Yamamoto would fly from his base in Rabaul to Balale Island on April 18, 1943, with 2 Betty bombers and an escort of 0 fighters. The time of the flight, the altitude, the route, everything was in the decoded text. The message was a document that could avenge Pearl Harbor. In Washington, a weighty decision had to be made. Should this information be used to hunt him down? If they did, the Japanese would realize that their codes had been leaked. But if they didn't, an irreplaceable opportunity would be missed. After long discussions and detailed military reports, the final decision was made: Yamamoto must be killed. The operation was given a symbolic name: Operation Vengeance. Now everything had to be done with clockwork precision. The target location, the flight path, the type of fighter jets to be used, the amount of fuel, everything was calculated. But there was one problem: the long distance between the American base on the island of Guadalcanal and Yamamoto's flight path. The pilots had to fly about 1,000 miles, much of it over the sea and without support. The slightest mistake meant certain death. Amidst the fire and smoke, amidst the vast blue of the ocean, a mission was taking shape that would not only mean revenge, but would also become one of the most precise air operations in history.
Washington's decision was implemented. Codes were broken, flight plans were drawn up, and fuel, range, and return probability were meticulously calculated. Of the available aircraft, only 1 fighter had the combination of speed, range, and ability to carry extra fuel tanks to complete the mission. the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, which could fly very long distances with 2 extra tanks under the wings. The U.S. Pacific Air Force, in cooperation with Fleet Command, selected a group of these aircraft and equipped them for the more than 1,000-mile round trip, a dangerous mission that required perfect navigation, radio silence, and millimeter precision timing. Pilot selection and flight structure were based on 2 axes: the Hunter Group, small aircraft designated for reconnaissance and direct attack, and the Air Cover Group, which was to repel air threats and defend against hunters. The flight leader was Major John Mitchell, who led a coordinated force of several P-38 squadrons. The final team consisted of about 16 to 18 aircraft from various squadrons, including the 339th and 70th Fighter Squadrons, and 4 kill flights were selected to deliver the final blow. Operational Command planned the program with the precise goal of reaching the intersection point of Yamamoto's bomber path at the specified time and with minimal fuel consumption. The long-duration flight mission required a complete overhaul of normal procedures. All pilots were instructed to complete radio silence. Any radio contact could give away the situation and ruin the mission. Navigation was based on dead reckoning, point-to-point timing, and minimal use of ground landmarks. Each pilot entering the mission had a specific mission. Some were responsible for holding the position and protecting the flanks, and some, as hunters, were assigned to detect and, if possible, destroy Yamamoto's carrier bomber. The night before, final checks were made on fuel, ammunition loads, and the correct installation of the additional tanks. The planes were loaded with 2 tanks to ensure sufficient operational range for the takeoff and return. At dawn, a force of P-38s took off from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. Their long route over the sea, cloud deserts, and island chains was in accordance with the timetable derived from the decoded message. Navigating the ocean day and night with no reliable or obvious landmarks was an undeniable challenge. Pilots spent hours charting their course based on the angle of the sun, stratiform wind speed, and knot counts to arrive over Yamamoto's predicted passage area at the appointed time. The pilot's endurance of a 400 to 500-mile one-way flight under the pressure of the possibility of conflict was a severe test of their courage and skill. At the same time, the decrypted information, derived from the work of the top analysts at Hypo Station, had provided the precise route and timing of Yamamoto's movement. It was this evidence that gave American decision-makers the courage to risk using the leaked code. The realization that using the broken information could indicate that the codes had been leaked was the moral and tactical Achilles heel of the operation. But the military leadership accepted this intelligence risk because the chance of missing a unique strategic target was too great. The silent flight, with all its complications, was slowly approaching the intersection point. The pilots, in small, noisy cockpits, saw final images of fuel, engine speed, and arrival time. Everything had to be precise. A few minutes of delay could ruin the entire effort or expose them to enemy air escorts. In that vast horizon, the revenge mission was no longer just a military maneuver. It was a test of human precision and the technology of the time, in which every technical detail, from the installation of fuel tanks to the angle of attack, had a fateful meaning.
The calm ocean horizon suddenly revealed a crack in the movement. A line of planes, low and steady, cutting through the clouds. The P-38 pilots, who had been flying silently and intently for hours, were first struck by a sudden sense of presence, a line of Japanese planes moving over the sea, following the course announced in the decoded message. The heart of the mission beat faster in the first seconds. What was to be seen was now before their eyes, the great shape of the Betty bombers and the support of the Zero escorts. The prepared operation was not necessarily a simple attack encounter. It was a dance of timing and positioning that each pilot had to observe to the most precise parameters. Silently and signally, not by radio, but by coordinated visual path, the flight command determined the target position and the time of attack. In this section,
Dead map navigation and the counting of the nines intertwined a stream of technical decisions. The angle of attack, the optimum altitude for arcing fire, and the speed that would allow for a return. The pilots of the advance group, with their eyes fixed on the horizon, detected the first enemy elements. The moment the target bomber, the plane carrying the heroic Yamamoto and his convoy, actually appeared in visual view, the tension was at its peak. Visual sighting was of decisive importance. Hearsay information was not to be relied on alone. Field confirmation was essential, especially for an operation whose political and intelligence implications could be far-reaching. The precise identification of Yamamoto's carrier bomber was made by examining its flight pattern, airframe composition, and crew arrangement. The clear and concise decision: the 4 designated strikers were to be launched simultaneously and from different angles at the target bomber to minimize the opportunity for defensive counterattack by the Zero escorts. They positioned themselves so that they could fire with maximum accuracy in a very short window of time and isolate the special machine that was the carrier of the American commander's long-cherished desire. The initial fire broke through the heavy silence. The sound of a few short shots quickly became a guiding wave of fire in the air. The engagements were swift and precise. One P-38 attacked from the left, another from a lower altitude, and a third from the side. The combination of these attacks sent the target bomber into a sudden rout. The Zero escorts tried to react, but the sudden coordination of the attack and the concentration of the Allied fire deprived them of the opportunity to make a full-scale defense. In the midst of the chaos of aircraft, the main target, Yamamoto's carrier, separated itself from its group's flight path in a moment of fire and smoke. Flames rose from the wings and fuselage. Black smoke left a trail of explosive fuel in the sky. Seconds later, they realized the shocked falling body of the plane. Flames, a crack in the structure, and then a loss of flight control that sent it hurtling toward the sea. But that was only the beginning of the critical moment. This was by far the most dangerous part of the mission, as the American pilots had to quickly reposition themselves, assess the damage to their planes, and at the same time fend off the threat of enemy escorts. Several planes on both sides were damaged. Smoke and metal fragments hung in the air, and the aerial battlefield at that moment was both a spectacle and a horror. A mistake at this point meant everything. A miscalculation of the angle, a delay in reaction, or a navigation error could have destroyed everything. But the mission design had already tried to minimize these errors by increasing the synchronism and concentration of fire. After a moment of contemplation and counting their initial casualties, the pilots pulled away to conserve the fuel needed for the return and to prepare for the long, slow, but cautious return. The broken body of Yamamoto's carrier bomber sank into the waves. Its fire formed a small point of flame light on the dark ocean surface that quickly died out. Only smoke and specks of debris remained on the surface. Meanwhile, as the waves cleared the fire from the surface, the American pilots began their return line. They knew that the key moment of the mission had occurred, but they still had to return to base alive to record the full narrative of the mission and examine its consequences. After the planes returned and in the security of headquarters, initial reports came that the main target had been destroyed. A sense of heaviness and liberation swept over the pilots. The knowledge that the dangerous mission had not only been accomplished, but had achieved its intended purpose, lifted a heavy burden of real and deterrent commitment from the decision-makers. At the same time, the moral and strategic implications began to emerge. The proof of the effectiveness of the code breaking and its implications for the continued intelligence work, and the implications of a direct operation against a high-ranking commander, a move that would require extensive political and military analysis in the future.
The destruction of Admiral Yamamoto's aircraft carrier was like a stone thrown into calm water, sending ripples in all directions. The first consequence was a psychological and practical disruption in the upper echelons of the Japanese command, which had lost one of the rare architects of rapid attack strategy and meticulous planning. Yamamoto was not only a military leader, but also a symbol of Japan's operational ideology in the Pacific, a combination of audacity, calculation, and a belief in preemptive strikes. With his death, a significant part of this symbolic logic was damaged, a void that was felt not only in the command structure, but also in the psyche of the Imperial Army. In Kishoshu, Tokyo, and the command centers, official and unofficial reports followed one after another. In each message, an attempt was evident to understand the cause and course of events. The initial analysis from the Japanese headquarters was not conclusive. First, the manner in which the flight plan had been leaked was hotly debated, and second, the political message of the successful enemy attack on a high-ranking commander was a blow to public pride and to the strong image that the military leadership wanted to project. Various rumors circulated among officers and soldiers. Some attributed Yamamoto's loss to miscalculations, others to betrayal or a leak of information, and still others to the enemy's technical superiority over their intelligence infrastructure. The military consequences, however, were more tangible and less immediate. Yamamoto played a decisive role in the planning of operations and the distribution of resources. His absence meant a rapid revision of some plans and a delay in decisions that had previously been aligned with Yamamoto's logic. The replacement commanders, faced with the task of dealing with the ongoing war, made a series of decisions that sometimes led to disorganization and increased logistical costs. In the field, this disorganization was manifested in slow reactions, slow distribution of supplies, and reduced efficiency of naval and air force coordination. On the other hand, Japanese public opinion was faced with the widespread media impact of the assassination of a famous commander. The imperial government tried to control the news and explain the disaster as the result of the martyrdom of a great soldier. But inwardly, the policymaking camp realized that this event provided an opportunity for the enemy to take advantage of his psychological advantage. The Americans, in their headquarters, also understood this psychological consequence. In Washington's view, a successful operation was not only a tactical blow, but also a sign of intelligence and operational capability that could affect future war plans. On the field, Japanese units on some fronts temporarily restructured their command. These changes in management, along with logistical implications, meant that some attacks or troop movements were delayed or required reconfirmation that had previously been carried out quickly and with the view of the dominant commander. This slowness in response and coordination in some areas, such as the Southern Islands and the Pacific supply lines, gave the Allies few but crucial opportunities to increase their pressure or to reorganize their positions. At the same time, the American intelligence operation responsible for breaking the codes was recorded as a triumph. But this victory came at a complex cost. Washington was aware that if the Japanese public or even the high leadership became aware that the codes had been broken, the enemy would have greater access to important Japanese intelligence sources and would have wider consequences for future operations. Part of the policy-making calculations was therefore to protect this secret information source from direct disclosure, a policy that meant avoiding continued or overt use of any decrypted data unless the strategic benefit vastly outweighed the cost of disclosure. This difficult balance between tactical use and strategic protection was one of the complex lessons of Operation Revenge. The event also resonated in the diplomatic sphere. The governments and statesmen of the U.S. allies touted Washington's ability in intelligence and military efforts. From the perspective of the coalition partners, it was a sign that the secrets of the Japanese emperor were also fragile. But in turn, Japan's regional allies also looked at the issue with concern. If the intelligence defense of a great empire could be so damaged, what guarantee was there of their continued control and military support? Ultimately, Yamamoto's death quickly entered the annals of the war. But this entry appeared not as a one-dimensional phenomenon, but as a complex knot in a web of decision-making, coordination, morale, and information. The Americans were able to seize a unique intelligence opportunity and demonstrate a balance between the will to revenge and technical skill. But the long-term consequences of this action, ranging from the psychological consequences in Japan to the intelligence and diplomatic consequences at the international level, imposed a heavy and complex cost on both sides. This echo of the explosion was only the beginning of a series of consequences that policymakers and commanders would have to read and respond to in the months and years to come.
The surviving planes returned to base, exhausted and silent after a long flight over the sea. The ocean breeze blew through the weary blades of the P-38s, coating the metal surfaces of the wings with a dampness. They were running out of fuel, and every second they got closer to the runway meant saving them from certain crashing. No one spoke, even as the first wheel of the advanced plane touched down and the sound of tires whined through the air. Only the glances between the returning pilots carried something more than fatigue, the weight of knowing that the mission they had accomplished had changed history. In the silence of the evening, the reports began. One by one, the intelligence officers called the pilots to record the route, the time of contact, and the details of the engagement. Each short answer was written down in thick notebooks. No one wanted to lie, but everyone knew they had something to hide, the true source of the information, the broken code. Even within the unit itself, the secret was kept like a thick wall. Only a few who were directly involved in the planning knew that the operation was based on knowledge that should not be revealed. For others, the official narrative was an accidental patrol flight that hit an enemy target. But reality was in the eyes of every returning pilot. They had doubts about seeing the enemy bomber go down and knowing that the explosion had taken the life of the enemy's most important commander. Some vacillated between pride and sorrow, pride in military success and sorrow at the human realization of what they had done, ending the life of another human being, albeit an enemy, but a human being with plans, aspirations, and status. This ambivalent feeling remained with many of them for years to come. A few days later, confirmed reports from Japanese sources reached American headquarters. The news of Yamamoto's death was announced by the enemy in a cautious and formal tone. It was the final confirmation of the mission. At that moment, the intelligence officers in the darkened rooms of Washington nodded silently. The technical success was perfect, but in the silence of those rooms, a question was whispered that no one would utter aloud. Was it worth exposing such a vital source of information to the risk of disclosure? The answer was lost in time. The codes were changed shortly thereafter, but not so quickly as to completely eliminate American access. Despite the risk, their bold decision at least paid off. But deep within the War Department, further analysis showed that such actions, the targeted assassination of high-ranking commanders based on decrypts, had pushed the boundaries of morality and military ethics. The world was at war, but in the shadows, a new kind of war was being waged. A war of information, of codes, of minds. In the months that followed, the returning pilots were sent on other missions. The name Yamamoto was only occasionally mentioned in the quiet nighttime conversations, often in a cold, sometimes weary, sometimes proud tone. Some of them later wrote in their memoirs that the moment they saw that bomber's fire in the sky never left their minds, not with joy, but as the moment they realized how far a man would go for a mission, for duty. At a higher level, the American command hid the operation in classified archives. Until the end of the war, the official account of the mission told only part of the truth. It was years before the full details were released, and the mission's code name, Operation Vengeance, appeared in the public record. But by then, many of those who had flown would not live to see history judge them. An image was etched in the memories of those who remained. The sound of twin engines, the horizon of the sea, a smoke-filled sky, and a brief moment of silence after the fire. A silence that marked not only the end of the mission,
but the beginning of a new era in the concept of war. One where the battle no longer took place in the sky and on the ground, but within the secrets, the shadows, and the broken codes that determined the fate of nations.
The death in the sky had not only shattered a man's body, but also torn and rewound threads in the military and intelligence networks on both sides. In Tokyo, the High Command was anxiously and furiously reconstructing the narrative. Intensive debriefing sessions were held, trying to figure out why a top commander had failed to protect him. This review was not simply a military response, but a re-examination of methods and of the very reliance on communications and cryptography. Japanese officials tried both to find the source of the leak and to think of ways to harden the systems. But the reality was that the damage was more than just a few technical changes. Strategic trust in the intelligence infrastructure had been shaken. In Washington, critics and defenders alike were weighing the consequences. Intelligence headquarters knew that a success had been achieved in the field that could enhance their information penetration, but that the same headquarters would have to pay the price of keeping a strategic resource secret. So, after successful implementation, a conservative policy was adopted: selective and limited use of classified information. Use only in cases where the strategic value of overt exploitation clearly outweighed the risk of disclosure. This conservative approach preserved the secret juice of continued decoding work while preventing routine exploitation that could lead to complete knowledge of the enemy. At a more operational level, the Air Force and the headquarters learned important lessons: the need for precise long-range navigation, the necessity of multiple squadron coordination, and the sensitivity of fuel management in operations beyond normal range. The operation demonstrated that by changing the aircraft configuration, adding fuel tanks, and training pilots to target, much longer missions were possible than had previously been possible. As a result, new guidelines were developed, from strict radio silence regulations to detailed protocols for return and reporting, all designed to ensure that the operation remained successful and left no trace of intelligence. The moral aspect of the matter was also reflected in command circles and academia. The justification was put forward that in the midst of war, any action that saved the lives of fellow citizens was justified. But some thinkers and politicians warned that crossing the line between military operations and targeting specific individuals would distort the legal and moral implications in the long run. In military circles, the technical argument prevailed. From the perspective of conducting war and preserving national security, the deliberate elimination of an enemy leader who would weaken the enemy's power was explicable. But in the public and historical arena, direct action based on broken information raised deeper questions that remained the subject of debate for decades. Subsequent generations of military and intelligence analysts cited the operation as a classic example of how combining code breaking with precise field execution could yield decisive victories, while at the same time avoiding an oversupply of information tools at the risk of identifying code-breaking techniques. Allied intelligence services devised new security structures, methods that not only strengthened the security of the code, but also carefully framed the decision-making process for the exploitation of sensitive information. From the perspective of military morale and culture, Yamamoto's death represented a dual effect. On the one hand, the strategic enemy experienced the loss of a symbolic leader, and on the other, the Allies gained operational motivation and confidence as successful users of intelligence. This motivation gradually affected subsequent operations, not only in technical terms, but also in the belief that major changes could be made through accurate intelligence and targeted air operations. At the local level, the pilots who took part in the mission carried the emotional baggage of that day with them when they returned to the lines. Some remembered the fire of the planes as a demonstration of efficiency, while others saw the same scenes as a symbol of the burden of human responsibility. This ambivalence reflected the broader social reaction to the operation, a victory that was accompanied by silence and hesitation, so to speak, making the taste of victory bitter for many of the participants. At the diplomatic level, an ambiguous message was sent to the world. America had demonstrated that it had the intelligence power and the speed to act in combination, and this was a deterrent to enemies who relied on their coded support. For the Allies, this created greater certainty that the alliance could benefit from a common intelligence capacity. But for countries that were in the shadow of Japan or other powers, this act was a reminder of the uncertainty of military and intelligence security. The sixth part of the narrative showed that a precise military action can set off a chain of reactions in the technical, moral, political, and psychological realms, reactions that sometimes manifest themselves in decisions and policies months and years later. This chapter of history brought lessons for operational planners and policymakers. The use of information is powerful, but it requires intelligent policymaking and keeping resources in the most confidential layers, and that the results on the ground always go beyond short-term military calculations and lead to structural and cultural changes.
Long-term monitoring of the tides and calculations of the war following that fatal event revealed changes. At the strategic level, Yamamoto's death challenged the hopes and theories that had been built on a single commander and a centralized military style. Japanese planners, who had previously counted on his leadership skills, were forced to rethink the way responsibilities were divided and command was concentrated. In practice, this meant distributing decision-making, adjusting offensive expectations, and creating new command networks to fill the void left by the lack of a strategic mind. The Allies, especially the United States, learned two important strategic lessons. First, that accurate intelligence sources could rapidly reshape the balance of power. And second, that access to this information alone was not enough unless there was also the capacity to execute on the ground and translate the data into action. Operation Vengeance was a combination of both, precise intelligence and flawless air execution, and demonstrated that the combination of these two elements could produce results beyond those of traditional operations. The tactical process in the Pacific Theater also changed somewhat. With greater confidence, American commanders used a combination of intelligence, reconnaissance, and limited strikes to target key enemy positions. The focus on vital supply points, command centers, and logistical lines gradually became the basis for the methods that would later be used in the larger Pacific campaigns. This new style of warfare, which could be called information operational warfare, gradually gained more weight and was a symbol of the Allies' military maturity in the face of the geopolitical expanse of the Pacific. On the diplomatic level, the message of the operation demonstrated that the Allies' technical prowess went beyond mere military engagement and could also be effective in the realm of political and psychological influence. For the Allied governments, this was a concrete and tangible information victory. For Japan's regional allies, it was a sobering reminder of the vulnerability of infrastructure and codes. The implicit message of the operation was to undermine the enemy's confidence in the security of his information, something that had considerable strategic value in the long run. Among the manpower, the effects were varied and sometimes contradictory. In the states where the operation was conducted, the pilots and teams of analysts, each carrying with them different memories, depending on their role and personal experience. The pilot who had flown for hours and remembered the moment he saw fire. The analyst who had spent hours and days working on code tables and patterns. The political officer who had taken responsibility for the propaganda consequences. For some, the operation was an opportunity to prove the effectiveness of new methods. For others, it was a reminder of the heavy cost of secret decisions. One of the hidden effects of the operation was a change in the value of human resources in the war machine. Experience showed that a relatively limited but highly focused and intelligence-based operation could produce decisive results in the field. This insight played a key role in subsequent decisions about the allocation of intelligence resources and the focus on training special intelligence forces. In other words, Operation Revenge gave a new identity to the function of intelligence services. No longer just the collection of information, but its transformation into purposeful tactical action became an integral part of war strategy. On the other hand, Japanese society and its military experienced complex and multifaceted reactions to the loss of Yamamoto. The absence of a charismatic leader led to a decrease in coordination and command disruptions in the short term, but in the long term, some levels of command attempted to prevent the vulnerability of concentration by distributing responsibilities and training multiple successors. This structural shift, an adaptive response to the information shock, demonstrated that military systems could learn from strategic trauma and reorganize, although this reorganization was not always easy or inexpensive. In the wake of this event, universities and military academies in the Allies began to delve deeper into the new concepts of warfare. Articles and studies published in the decades after the war identified Operation Revenge as one of the first successful examples of information warfare, an event that demonstrated how the combination of broken intelligence and precise execution could transform the framework of military planning. These studies later became sources for training in military academies, introducing a generation of commanders and analysts to new synthetic concepts of intelligence and operations. In the public sphere, the echo of the news of the destruction of a high-ranking commander became a historical symbol over time. In the United States, it was considered part of the collection of intelligence achievements and the bravery of pilots. In Japan, it was a sign of the tragedy and vulnerability of an empire. These two different narratives shaped history itself in a multifaceted perspective, showing that every major military event entails different and sometimes contradictory readings. Finally, the seventh part of the operational narrative paints a picture of a continuous evolution, how a limited tactical action can provoke a series of reflections and rethinkings in technical, structural, and cultural fields. From a macro perspective, Operation Revenge was recorded as a turning point in the history of the Pacific War, a symbol that showed that modern warfare was no longer simply an arena of bullets and iron, but one in which information, timing, and precision could determine the identity of outcomes.
The successful operation that took place in the heart of the sky reverberated in military and intelligence circles long after the fires of that day had died down, gradually becoming formal and unwritten lessons that redefined the structure of warfare for decades to come. The first and clearest of these lessons was the importance of integrating intelligence with operational capability, knowledge that is of relative value on its own, but when combined with the capacity to execute on the ground, can be a turning point in the course of a war. Operation Vengeance demonstrated that code breaking and careful analysis of messages are only maximally useful when there is an operational chain ready to exploit the information, long-range navigation, equipped aircraft, and trained pilots. New rules were formed in the military and intelligence response. Allied intelligence agencies quickly developed policies that emphasized the selective use of classified information, a rule that conservatively stated that data should be used only in cases where the strategic value of the use far outweighed the cost of revealing the source. This rule created a kind of strategic insurance that reserved intrusion resources for critical and time-consuming missions. In practice, this meant creating additional layers of protection for code-breaking resources and processes for assessing the risk of exploitation. Ethical and legal questions also quickly entered the formal text of the discussions. Direct operations against a specific commander, in the view of some theorists, changed the boundaries of acceptable military behavior. They raised the debate about targeting real individuals based on broken information to the level of international and scientific concern. In academic circles, articles were published that, while praising the technical efficiency of the operation, warned that the normalization of such encounters could lead to standards that, in the long run, undermined human rights and the rules of engagement. These ethical debates were later reflected in the charters and instructions of intelligence agencies and became a factor in the creation of frameworks that placed the use of sensitive information within a clear, legal, and ethical framework. The impact of the operation on the command structure and military culture of Japan was also profound and multifaceted. Yamamoto's absence led to a reassessment of the centralization of leadership and the dangers of relying solely on a charismatic individual. Japanese planners gradually implemented policies that distributed responsibilities, strengthened support structures, and reduced centralization of decision-making. These structural changes, while a logical response to a strategic loss, came at a cost in terms of efficiency and coordination in the short term. From a technological and tactical perspective, tangible gains were made. Long-range navigation and the design of more advanced aircraft for longer missions became more important. Pilots were trained in new skills in flawless navigation, fuel management, and special target engagement. These lessons were later used to design more complex missions and develop aircraft with longer ranges and payloads. In addition, the relationship between intelligence, air, sea, and land became more coherent, a model of multi-dimensional coordination that has since become the standard for sensitive missions. From the perspective of historical and symbolic memory, Operation Revenge created a multi-layered symbol. For the United States and its allies, the operation demonstrated the power of technology and the will to revenge that could be carried out quickly and accurately. For sections of Japanese society, it was a tragic and shocking event that demonstrated the weakness of intelligence and the vulnerability of an empire. In museums, memoirs, and books, the narrative of this operation has always been combined with technical and human axes, becoming a lesson for later generations. Finally, the legacy of operations in the intelligence profession is tangible, establishing protocols for confidential decision-making, assessing intelligence sources, and training generations of analysts and commanders to operate on the edge of reality and secrecy. Above all, this legacy is a reminder of a fundamental principle. Information has real value when it is combined with sovereign power and operational precision, but it must always be guarded by ethical and strategic considerations. On that day in the Blue Ocean, this message was delivered to the world in a bitter and clear voice, a message that changed the history of modern warfare forever.
After those tense days of critical decisions, the repercussions of the operation spread worldwide. Allied commanders and analysts, carefully examining the data and results of the mission, realized that combining classified information with precise operational execution could change the course of the war at a critical moment. Post-operational analyses showed that momentary accuracy and quick decision-making, even in uncertain and risky conditions, could prevent further losses and influence the subsequent course of the battle. In Japan, the absence of Yamamoto and the gap in the command center made it even more important to focus on risk management and the distribution of responsibilities. The experience of this operation showed that complete dependence on one person and excessive concentration of power could create strategic vulnerability in critical situations. The operational and tactical lessons learned from the mission later led to structural changes in pilot training and the development of aviation and navigation technologies, enabling future generations to perform more complex missions with greater precision and safety. From a human and ethical perspective, the operation was a reminder of the limitations and ethical responsibilities of using sensitive information. Analysts and commanders learned that the exploitation of classified data must always be conducted within the framework of strategic and ethical considerations to minimize unnecessary damage and political and humanitarian consequences. The operational legacy of the mission was a model of coordination between intelligence and field execution, risk management, and the intelligent use of resources that was used in military and intelligence training for generations to come. In addition to its technical and strategic lessons, the operation was recorded in the history of modern warfare as a symbol of the power of momentary decision-making, precision, and the ability to coordinate in critical situations. and has always been studied as an example of the success of complex operations with widespread effects. This was the end of the story of the operation, but its lessons remained in the minds of commanders and analysts, shaping the course of planning and executing future missions, so that every decision on the battlefield was not only linked to courage, but also to wisdom, precision, and ethics.